Welcome to the Hidden Truth. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell. The music throbbed against the walls, bass heavy and relentless, rattling the windows of the sprawling suburban house. Laughter and the clink of glasses floated through the air, mingling with the sweet, cloying scent of cheap cologne and too many scented candles. I sat alone at the edge of the room, my beer growing warm in my hand, my eyes locked on the sight unfolding before me like some slow-motion car crash I couldn't look away from. There she was, Rachel, my wife of 13 years, leaning too close to another man, laughing at something he had said, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. Her dress, a shade too short and far too tight, shimmered under the party lights as she tossed her head back in laughter, exposing the slender curve of her neck. The same neck I had kissed countless times before we drifted into this chasm between us. I took a long pull from my beer, the bitterness scratching down my throat, but it didn't drown the sour taste rising in my mouth. My friends moved around me, oblivious or maybe just politely pretending not to notice. Small-town manners, after all. What business was it of theirs if a man's wife found amusement elsewhere? I stared down at the sweating bottle in my hand, willing myself to stay seated, to not make a scene, to not be that guy, the pathetic husband whose emotions spilled out in public for everyone to gawk at. But every fiber of my being screamed at me, clawed at my insides, demanding action, demanding acknowledgement. How had it come to this? It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Rachel looked at me like I was the only man in the room. I could still remember the first night we met, an awkward, accidental collision in the narrow aisle of a bookstore downtown. She dropped her armful of poetry books. I apologized profusely as I helped gather them up. Her laugh back then had been different, softer, real, filled with a warmth that wrapped around me like a favorite sweater. Our first date had been dinner at a diner that smelled of fried onions and burnt coffee, followed by a walk along the river where she linked her arm through mine and smiled up at me like she could already see the future. I proposed to her after 6 months, too in love and too young to understand what that kind of commitment truly meant. She said yes with tears in her eyes and a voice full of hope. We built a life together in this town, piece by piece. Mortgage, promotions, family holidays, anniversaries marked by cheap champagne and promises whispered against the dark. Through the good and the bad, we stood side by side. Until we didn't. Until the silences grew longer, the conversations shorter. Until work late nights became routine, and smiles grew strained. Until tonight. The man she flirted with now wasn't even subtle. His hand hovered a little too close to her hip. His smile lingered a little too long. And Rachel, God help me, she welcomed it. She fed it. I felt like an invisible man sitting there, watching her betray me by inches, by glances, by the curve of her painted lips around each laugh that wasn't for me anymore. I shifted in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and for a moment, her eyes flicked toward me. Our gazes locked. And then she looked away. Just like that. As if I was no more important than the battered coffee table between us or the half-empty chip bowl someone had abandoned nearby. The breath left my lungs in a slow, painful hiss. I wanted to rage. To stand up, to shout across the room, to demand from her the loyalty she had once so freely offered. But I didn't. I couldn't. I sat there, anchored by shame and heartbreak and the crushing realization that somewhere along the way, I had become utterly, helplessly disposable. The party blurred around me, a smear of faces and voices and music pounding too loud against my temples. Someone handed me another beer. I accepted it without thinking. I drank because it dulled the edges, made everything hazy enough that I could almost convince myself that none of it mattered. But deep down, it did. Every laugh she shared with that man, every lingering touch, every glance she withheld from me, it mattered. It carved pieces out of me, small, jagged pieces that left me hollow and raw. At some point, Rachel disappeared from my view. I scanned the crowd, my stomach twisting into knots. She wasn't by the bar. She wasn't by the fireplace where a group of women gossiped and drank wine from plastic cups. Panic flared, hot and sudden. I rose to my feet, weaving through the bodies, brushing past sweaty shoulders and clouded smiles. I pushed open the back door, stepping out onto the deck where the humid summer night wrapped around me like a damp shroud. There, under the pale glow of the porch light, I saw her. Rachel, pressed up against the side of the house, her arms looped around that man's neck, her mouth moving against his in a kiss so hungry, so desperate, it ripped the breath from my chest. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a silent witness to the shattering of my world. She didn't see me. Neither of them did. And even if she had, I realized with a bone-deep ache, she wouldn't have stopped. I turned and stumbled back into the house, the noise swallowing me whole. I found my keys by the front door, fumbled with the lock on my truck, and climbed inside, slamming the door shut hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The engine idled beneath me, the dash lights casting a sickly green glow across the cab. I could go back in there. I could drag her out by the wrist, humiliate her the way she had humiliated me. But what would that change? Nothing. Not the fact that she had made her choice. Not the fact that our marriage, our life, had already ended in all the ways that mattered. And certainly not the fact that some part of me, some weak, battered part, still loved her. Still wanted her to turn back to me. Still wanted to believe in the fantasy we had built together, even as it crumbled in my hands. I didn't remember driving home. One moment I was sitting at the party, drowning in heartbreak. The next I was pulling into our driveway, the porch light casting a pale, lonely circle across the front steps. The house was dark, empty, silent. I sat in the truck for a long time before finally gathering the courage to go inside. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of something burning faintly, maybe the remnants of a candle Rachel had left lit. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost. Everything looked the same, our pictures still lined the hallway. Her favorite blanket was still draped across the couch, but nothing felt the same. The life we had built was over. I just hadn't realized it until tonight. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a man unmoored, adrift in a life he no longer recognized. I thought about the woman I had fallen in love with, the promises we had made, the future we had planned. And I thought about the woman I had seen tonight, wrapped around another man, her loyalty abandoned as easily as shedding a coat. Somewhere along the line, she had stopped choosing me. And now, I had to make a choice of my own. The morning after the party, the house was unnaturally silent, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting to see which way the cracks would split. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee I hadn't touched, staring blankly at the worn wood grain beneath my fingertips. The clock on the wall ticked with a sound far louder than it should have been, each second hammering the reality of the previous night deeper into my bones. Rachel came home just after sunrise. I heard the soft crunch of tires in the gravel driveway, the metallic squeal of the screen door hinges as she slipped inside. She hesitated in the hallway, her figure outlined against the morning light streaming through the front windows. For a moment, she seemed frozen there, uncertain whether to come in or flee. Part of me hoped she would flee. It would have been easier. But she didn't. She stepped into the kitchen, her heels clicking lightly against the linoleum. She wore the same dress from the night before, now wrinkled and rumpled in ways that needed no explanation. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smeared into dark crescents beneath her bloodshot eyes. She looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us said a word. The silence between us was thick and suffocating, weighted by everything we both knew and everything neither of us was willing to say aloud. Rachel opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she dropped her keys onto the counter with a clatter that made me flinch. She turned away from me, moving to the sink, where she stood with her back rigid, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles whitened. I waited. Waited for an apology. Waited for an explanation. Waited for something that could make sense of the wreckage. But none came. Finally, I stood, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, and walked past her without a word. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, and shut the bedroom door behind me with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a gunshot. I spent the next 2 days drifting around the house like a ghost, moving through the familiar rooms that now felt hollowed out, stripped of meaning. Rachel was there too, somewhere in the periphery, a shadow haunting the edges of my vision. We existed like two strangers trapped in the same sinking ship, each pretending the other wasn't there. On the third morning, a Saturday, I found her sitting on the back porch with a mug of coffee cradled between her hands, staring blankly out at the yard we had once planned to landscape together but never did. She looked tired. Small. Defeated. Without turning to look at me, she said, "We need to talk." Her voice was hoarse, raw. I considered ignoring her. Walking away. Pretending I hadn't heard. But something inside me, stubborn and battered, refused. I sat down heavily in the chair across from her, the wooden slats digging into my back. Rachel took a long, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I don't know what else to say." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. She stared down into her coffee as if it held answers. "It didn't mean anything," she whispered. I almost laughed. Almost. Because it had meant everything. She started to cry then, soft, broken sobs that shook her thin shoulders. I watched her without moving, feeling hollowed out, detached. Once, the sight of her in pain would have torn me apart, would have moved me to comfort her without hesitation. But now, all I felt was a distant, aching exhaustion. After a long moment, she scrubbed at her face with the sleeve of her sweater and looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading. "I was lonely," she said. "I felt invisible. You were always working, always tired, always somewhere else even when you were here." The words hit harder than any slap. Not because they weren't true, but because they were. And yet, they didn't excuse what she had done. "I made mistakes too," I said, my voice low and rough. "But I never betrayed you." Rachel flinched as if I had struck her. The silence between us widened into a chasm too deep to cross. Days passed. We coexisted, barely speaking, moving around each other like two planets caught in the dying pull of each other's gravity. Friends called. I ignored them. Work called. I told them I needed more time. The only thing that seemed real was the pain, raw and insistent, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Late at night, lying awake in the dark, I replayed that moment on the porch over and over, the way she had looked at him, the way she had touched him, the way she had kissed him without hesitation, without guilt. It was a wound that refused to scab over. And I didn't know how to heal it. One afternoon, while Rachel was out, at the grocery store, or maybe just escaping the suffocating tension of the house, I found myself wandering into the attic. The trapdoor creaked open, dust motes swirling in the thin shaft of sunlight. I climbed the rickety ladder and emerged into a space that smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, old Christmas decorations, baby clothes, photo albums yellowed with age. I don't know what drew me to one particular box in the corner, but once I opened it, I knew there was no turning back. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All written in Rachel's neat, looping handwriting. All addressed to the same name. And none of them to me. I sat there on the floor of the attic for what felt like hours, reading letter after letter, each one carving deeper into the soft, ruined parts of me. The man's name was Eric. The same man from the party. The same man she had kissed while I watched, unseen. The letters were love letters. Full of longing. Full of regret. Full of promises whispered in ink. I closed the box slowly, my hands trembling. There was no salvaging this. There was no fixing it. Rachel hadn't just stumbled into a moment of weakness. She had built another life, another love, right under my nose. And I had been too blind, or too trusting, to see it. When Rachel came home that evening, she found me sitting at the kitchen table with the box of letters in front of me. She froze in the doorway, the blood draining from her face. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and sat down across from me. Her hand shook as she reached for the letters, but I pulled the box away. "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "You don't get to hide from this." Tears welled up in her eyes. I never meant for you to find out like this, she whispered. Then what did you mean to do, Rachel? I asked. Keep lying? Keep pretending? She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And I realized, with a cold, detached clarity, that I didn't care anymore. Her pain no longer moved me. Her tears no longer softened me. Something inside me had died. And there was no resurrecting it. That night I packed a bag. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I simply walked out the door, got into my truck, and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. Not in that house. Not with those memories. Not with her. The highway stretched out before me, endless and empty, the asphalt shimmering under the setting sun. I drove until the town disappeared in my rearview mirror, until the weight on my chest eased just enough to breathe again. I drove until the night swallowed me whole. And somewhere, far from the life I had built and lost, I began to imagine what it might mean to start over. To be free. To be whole. To be mine. The road stretched out before me, a dark ribbon unspooling beneath the tires of my old pickup, the steady hum of the engine the only sound keeping me tethered to reality. I didn't have a destination in mind. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to put distance between myself and the life I had just abandoned. Behind me, the world I had built brick by brick, year by year, crumbled into dust. Somewhere around midnight, I pulled into a deserted rest stop, the flickering neon lights casting sickly green shadows across the cracked pavement. I killed the engine and sat there for a long while, staring out at the emptiness, feeling it seep into me, filling all the hollow places Rachel had carved out with her betrayal. I thought about calling someone. But who? My parents were long gone. My brother and I hadn't spoken in years, a casualty of old grudges and stubborn pride. Friends? They were mostly her friends now, mutual acquaintances who would mutter awkward condolences and then quietly disappear, not wanting to choose sides. No, there was no one to call. No one to save me. And maybe that was fitting. Maybe, in the end, we're all meant to save ourselves. I spent that first night sleeping in the cab of my truck, curled awkwardly against the door with a jacket for a pillow. I woke stiff and sore, my mouth dry, my stomach knotted with hunger and something worse, a hollow ache that gnawed at the center of me. The sunrise was a smear of blood across the sky, too bright, too raw. I shielded my eyes and drove. Days blurred into each other. Small towns blinked past my windows, abandoned gas stations, sagging barns, lonely diners with neon signs that buzzed and sputtered in the early evening gloom. I didn't stay long anywhere. Just enough time to grab a cup of burnt coffee, to wash my face in a cracked bathroom mirror, to feel human for a few minutes before the weight of what I had lost crashed back over me. I wasn't running, not exactly. I was surviving. Or trying to. It was in a little town called Granger's Hollow, a place so small it didn't even show up on most maps, that I finally stopped for more than a few hours. The truck was gasping for life, and frankly, so was I. There was a battered motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering vacancy signs and faded curtains that never quite closed. I checked in with a few crumpled bills, the clerk barely glancing up from his ancient television set, and collapsed onto a sagging mattress that smelled faintly of mildew and lost hopes. I slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke, I felt marginally more human. Hungry. Weary. Still broken, but at least breathing. It was something. I showered in the tiny stall, the water lukewarm at best, and shaved the stubble from my jaw. Staring at my reflection, I barely recognized the man looking back at me. He looked older. Harder. Colder. But there was something else too. Something steelier in the set of his jaw. Something that looked an awful lot like resolve. The town itself was nothing special. A main street with a diner, a hardware store, a gas station. A scattering of houses with sagging porches and overgrown yards. It was the kind of place people passed through without stopping, unless they had nowhere else to be. Which suited me just fine. I found work at the garage on the corner, changing oil, patching tires, doing grunt work the locals didn't want to dirty their hands with. The owner, a wiry old man named Hank, didn't ask questions. He paid cash at the end of each week and let me keep to myself. It was perfect. In the evenings, I would sit in the corner booth at the diner, nursing a cup of coffee and picking at whatever plate of food the waitress set in front of me. I didn't need a menu. After a few days, either did she. "Same as usual?" she would ask, pencil poised over her notepad. "Yeah," I would grunt. Sometimes she tried to make small talk, but she learned quickly that I wasn't interested. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to disappear. And for a while I did. But grief, I discovered, is not a thing you can outrun. It rides with you. It sits beside you at the diner. It crawls into bed with you at night. It waits in the silence between heartbeats, in the spaces between breaths. One night, after a long, brutal shift at the garage, I found myself walking without thinking, my boots crunching over gravel and dirt as I made my way toward the edge of town. There was a small lake there, more a pond, really, its surface silvered under the full moon. I sat on the bank, my elbows resting on my knees, and stared out across the still water. And for the first time since leaving home, I let myself remember. Really remember. I thought about Rachel, the way she used to hum under her breath when she cooked breakfast, the way she would trace lazy circles on my back with her fingertips when we lay in bed talking about nothing at all. I thought about the life we had built together. The life I had believed in. The life she had burned to the ground. Tears blurred my vision, hot and shameful. I swiped them away angrily, but they kept coming, silent and relentless. I cried for the man I had been. For the dreams I had lost. For the love that had turned to ash in my hands. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff, my heart hollowed out. But there was a strange clarity, too. A clean, brutal certainty. Rachel had betrayed me. That was undeniable. But I had allowed myself to be blind, too wrapped up in routine and complacency to see the cracks forming until it was too late. I wasn't innocent. I wasn't blameless. And if I was going to survive, really survive, I had to own that. I had to stop looking back. I had to find a way to move forward. For myself. And no one else. The next morning, I walked into the hardware store on Main Street and bought a battered second-hand notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen. Back in my motel room, I sat at the rickety desk, opened the notebook to the first page, and began to write. Not about Rachel. Not about the betrayal. Not at first. I wrote about small things. The smell of motor oil at the garage, the way the sun caught the dust motes in the diner, the sharp, clean bite of autumn in the air. I wrote until my hand cramped and the cheap pen left blue smudges across my fingers. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something shift inside me. Something uncoiling. Something healing. It wasn't much. But it was a start. Weeks passed. Then months. I built a life in Granger's Hollow. A small, quiet, stubborn life. Work. Writing. The occasional polite nod to the waitress at the diner, who eventually learned my name was Jack, not the one I was born with, but the one I chose when I left my old life behind. And little by little, the pieces of me began to knit back together. Not perfectly. Not without scars. But strong in a new, fiercer way. One evening, as winter began to gnaw at the edges of the world, Hank offered me a beer after closing time. We sat on overturned milk crates behind the garage, the cold biting at our faces, the beer bottles sweating in our hands. He didn't ask about my past. I didn't offer. But in a gruff, roundabout way, he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes, he said, staring up at the hard, indifferent stars, life kicks the ever-loving shit out of you. Leaves you gasping in the dirt. But you get back up. You wipe the blood off your mouth. And you keep going. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because he was right. Because it was the only thing to do. Because survival wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about carrying it with you. And walking anyway. Winter came early that year, laying a heavy gray hand over Granger's Hollow. The first snow dusted the cracked sidewalks and clung to the skeletal trees, a stark contrast to the restless heat that had driven me here months ago. I stood at the window of my cramped motel room, watching flakes swirl and scatter under the flickering parking lot lights, feeling the cold creep into my bones despite the rattling heater in the corner. I was still here. Still breathing. Still putting one foot in front of the other, even when it felt like walking through quicksand. And yet, something was changing inside me, something slow and subtle, like the way frost crawls over a windowpane, reshaping the view without you even noticing until it's fully transformed. I had started to belong here. Not in the way I had belonged in my old life, with Rachel, with our hollow promises and carefully curated routines, but in a new way. A quieter, sturdier way. Built not on illusion, but on survival. On choice. On the decision, every day, to keep going. The garage became more than just a job. It became a refuge. Hank, gruff as he was, began to treat me like an equal instead of just another pair of hands. We didn't talk much beyond the necessities, what needed fixing, what parts to order, but there was a respect there, wordless and solid. One afternoon, after a brutal morning spent replacing the transmission on an ancient Chevy pickup, Hank handed me a cold beer from the mini-fridge in his cluttered office. "You're good at this," he said simply, cracking open his own can and settling heavily into the squeaky old office chair. I nodded, accepting the compliment for what it was. "I was good at a lot of things," I said, surprising myself with the bitterness in my voice. "Didn't stop it all from falling apart." Hank shrugged, taking a long pull from his beer. "Doesn't matter how good you are. Sometimes things break anyway." There was no pity in his tone. Just truth. And somehow, that made it easier to hear. I began to carve out a routine. Mornings at the garage. Evenings walking the back roads outside town, the fields stretching out endless and empty under the pale winter sky. Nights writing in the battered notebook I kept beside the bed. The words came slowly at first, halting and awkward, but they came. I didn't write about Rachel, not directly. I wrote about the way grief settles into your skin like cold, about the hollow ache of being forgotten, about the strange, stubborn hope that refuses to die even when everything else does. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes burned. I wrote because it was the only thing that made me feel real. Alive. Human. One evening, a few days before Christmas, I found myself at the diner later than usual. The place was almost empty, just me, the waitress, and an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie at the far corner booth. I sat nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the snow fall thick and fast outside the steamed-up windows. The bell above the door jingled, and a gust of cold air swept in. I looked up, and for a moment my heart stuttered painfully in my chest. It wasn't Rachel. Of course it wasn't. But the woman who walked in had the same curve of the jaw, the same tilt of the head, the same way of brushing the snow from her hair with a careless grace. She smiled at the waitress, stamped the snow from her boots, and took a seat at the counter a few stools down from me. I looked away quickly, ashamed of the sudden, aching longing that swelled inside me. Not for Rachel herself. Not anymore. But for what she had once represented. For the idea of home. Of belonging. Of being seen. The woman ordered a slice of cherry pie and a coffee. Her voice was warm, melodic, touched with a soft southern lilt. I sipped my own coffee, trying to focus on the newspaper spread out before me, but the words blurred together. Finally she spoke. "You're new around here," she said, her tone casual, friendly. I glanced at her, cautious. "Been here a few months." She smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through thick clouds. "I'm Ellie," she said, offering her hand across the gap between us. "Jack," I replied automatically, using the name I had given myself when I arrived. Her handshake was firm, sure. "Welcome to Granger's Hollow, Jack," she said, as if I hadn't already been here long enough to wear its dust on my skin. Over the next few weeks, Ellie and I fell into an easy, tentative companionship. She was a teacher at the elementary school, newly divorced, trying to find her own footing after her own share of heartbreak. We didn't talk much about our pasts. There was an unspoken agreement between us: wounds would be revealed slowly, if at all. Instead, we talked about safer things: the weather, the town's terrible Christmas parade, the diner's infamously bad meatloaf. It was easy. Comfortable. A balm I hadn't realized I needed. Sometimes we would sit together at the diner long after the coffee had gone cold, trading stories and silences, watching the snow pile up outside. Sometimes we would walk the back roads together, our boots crunching in the fresh snow, our breath misting in the cold night air. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I almost forgot the weight I carried. Almost. But grief has a long memory. And betrayal leaves deep scars. One night, as we sat side by side on the hood of her car, staring up at the stars, Ellie asked me, quietly, almost shyly, "Do you ever think about going back?" The question hit me like a hammer to the chest. Back. Back to the life I had left. Back to Rachel. Back to the ruins of the man I had been. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "There's nothing there for me anymore." Ellie nodded, her eyes sad but understanding. "Sometimes," she said, "the only way to survive is to let go." We sat in silence after that, the truth of it settling between us, heavy and real. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. I spent the day working a double shift at the garage, then sharing a quiet, unremarkable dinner with Hank and a few of the other strays who had nowhere else to be. It wasn't joyful. But it wasn't empty either. And maybe that was enough. Maybe, for now, survival was enough. As the new year approached, I found myself thinking more and more about the future. About what it might look like to build something new from the wreckage. About what it might mean to stop surviving and start living again. It was a terrifying thought. Starting over. Allowing myself to hope again. Allowing myself to care. But as I sat at the diner on New Year's Eve, nursing a cup of bad coffee and watching Ellie laugh with the waitress over some joke I couldn't hear, I realized something. Hope, once planted, has a stubborn way of growing. Even in the most barren soil. Even in a heart broken beyond recognition. I didn't make resolutions that night. No promises to be better or stronger or wiser. Just one simple vow. To keep going. To keep moving forward. No matter how long it took. No matter how hard it was. Because survival wasn't enough anymore. Not for me. Not anymore. I wanted more. And for the first time in a long, long time, I believed, deep down, fiercely, stubbornly, that I deserved it. January settled into Granger's Hollow like a heavy, wet blanket, muffling the world under gray skies and relentless snow. The days were short, the nights long and bitter. The salt trucks worked overtime, leaving the streets crusted in grime and slush, and the cold seeped into every crack, every corner of town. I worked through it all. The garage was busier than ever, broken down engines, dead batteries, tires shredded from hidden potholes. Hank grumbled about it, but I didn't mind. The work kept my hands busy, my mind quieter. It was easier to focus on engines and oil changes than on the hollow place still carved deep inside me. But at night, when the tools were hung up and the garage lights shut off, the loneliness returned, heavier somehow in the silence of winter. I filled my nights with writing. My notebook, once a tentative outlet, became a lifeline. Page after page, I spilled out the pieces of myself I hadn't dared voice aloud, the anger, the grief, the guilt, the hope that clung stubbornly to the corners of my mind like ivy creeping up a broken wall. Some nights, Ellie would join me at the diner, sliding into the booth across from mine with a tired smile and a cup of tea. We talked about nothing important, the miserable weather, the stray cat that had taken up residence behind the hardware store, the latest small-town gossip that everyone pretended not to care about but secretly devoured. And sometimes we didn't talk at all. Sometimes we just sat there, sharing the kind of silence that didn't demand anything from either of us. A rare, precious kind of peace. One Friday evening, as we walked back toward our cars, our breath hanging in the freezing air, Ellie stopped beside me, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. "You ever think about starting over?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I frowned, unsure what she meant. Starting over how? She shrugged, kicking at a patch of ice with the toe of her boot. A new life. A new place. A fresh start. The thought twisted in my chest. I had started over once already. Left behind everything I knew. Everything I loved. But starting over with someone else? Letting someone in again? Trusting again? The idea terrified me more than I wanted to admit. I don't know, I said honestly. Some days it feels possible. Other days, it feels like a fantasy. Ellie nodded, as if she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe that was why she never pushed, never asked for more than I could give. We stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at our coats, the stars distant and cold above us. And then, quietly, she said, "You deserve more than just surviving, Jack." She smiled, soft and sad, and walked away before I could find the words to respond. That night, I lay awake in my motel bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Did I deserve more? Did any of us? Or was survival the best any broken soul could hope for? I thought about Rachel. About the way her betrayal had hollowed me out. About the way I had clung to the wreckage because it was all I knew. And I thought about Ellie. About her quiet strength. About the way she never looked at me with pity, only understanding. About the way she made the weight on my chest a little easier to bear. Maybe, I thought, just maybe, survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to start living again. Even if it scared the hell out of me. The next morning, the town woke to a blizzard that turned the world into a swirling, chaotic mess of white. Roads closed. Power lines sagged under the weight of ice. The garage shut down early, Hank muttering curses under his breath as he locked the doors. I drove slowly back to the motel, the wipers barely keeping up with the snow. But when I reached the parking lot, I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat in the truck, the engine idling, staring out at the storm. Without fully deciding to, I pulled out my phone. Ellie answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said, a smile in her voice even through the line. "You surviving Snowmageddon?" "Just barely," I said, and my voice cracked a little more than I intended. There was a pause. "You okay?" she asked, the teasing gone from her tone. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Can I come over?" I asked, the words rushing out before I could think better of them. Another pause. Then, "Yeah. Of course." Her address was only a few streets away. It felt like a lifetime. Her house was small, tucked between two larger, better-kept homes, but it was warm and filled with light. The smell of cinnamon and wood smoke hit me as soon as I stepped inside, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting it wash over me. Ellie took my coat, her fingers brushing against mine in a way that made something inside me ache. She led me to the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth and a battered couch sagged invitingly under the weight of a handmade quilt. We sat side by side, not touching, not speaking. Just existing. And it was enough. More than enough. At some point, I found myself talking. Really talking. The words tumbled out, about Rachel, about the betrayal, about the hollow ache that no amount of running or working could fill. Ellie listened, never interrupting, never judging. When I finally ran out of words, when my throat was raw and my hands were shaking from more than just the cold, she reached over and took my hand in hers. Her touch was warm, steady. Real. "You're not broken," she said softly. "You're hurt. There's a difference." I didn't have the strength to argue. Didn't want to. Instead, I let her pull me into a hug, her arms wrapping around me in a way that felt more like home than anything had in a very, very long time. And for the first time since my world had shattered, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth rebuilding. The next few weeks passed in a strange, fragile bubble. I still worked at the garage. Still wrote in my notebook. Still kept to myself more often than not. But slowly, carefully, I let Ellie into the spaces I had once barricaded so tightly. We had coffee at the diner. We walked the snowy back roads, her arm brushing against mine. We sat by the fire, sharing stories and silences. It wasn't a grand romance. It wasn't fireworks and declarations of eternal love. It was quieter than that. Sure. Built not on the frantic passion of newness, but on the hard, stubborn beauty of survival. Of choice. Of two broken souls deciding that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be broken alone. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Ellie turned to me, her eyes serious. "Are you still running, Jack?" The question hit harder than I expected. I thought about it. Really thought. Was I still running? From Rachel? From the man I had been? From the future I was too afraid to hope for? I looked at Ellie. At the way her eyes shone in the firelight. At the quiet strength in her posture, the patience in her smile. "No," I said finally. "I'm not running anymore." She smiled then, a real smile, full and bright, and leaned her head against my shoulder. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. I wasn't running anymore. I was moving forward. Step by painful, stubborn step. Into something new. Something real. Something mine. Spring in Granger's Hollow crept in slowly, hesitantly, like a wounded animal testing the air. The snow melted in sluggish patches, revealing the bruised earth beneath, and the air carried a damp, earthy smell that hinted at something new, something waiting just beyond the horizon. I found myself sitting on the steps outside the garage one evening after closing, the warm breeze teasing the stray curls at the back of my neck, the sound of frogs beginning to stir in the marshes beyond town. For the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel crushed by the weight of my own life. For the first time, I felt light. Not because the scars had healed. Not because the past had magically lost its sting. But because I had finally learned to carry it. To let it be a part of me without letting it define me. Ellie sat beside me, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped loosely around them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We watched the last light fade from the sky in companionable silence, the kind that spoke of battles fought and won, of demons faced and not entirely defeated but no longer in control. "I think I'm ready," I said after a while, my voice low and sure. Ellie turned her head, her eyes catching the last of the sunlight. "Ready for what?" I smiled, a slow, cautious thing. "To stop hiding. To stop running. To build something new." Her smile matched mine, slow and genuine and a little tremulous. "With me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I reached over, taking her hand in mine. "With you," I said. And for the first time since my world had shattered, I knew I meant it. It wasn't a perfect transition. It wasn't a sweeping, cinematic montage of happiness blooming overnight. It was messy and slow and filled with moments of doubt. The first time I left a spare toothbrush at Ellie's place, I panicked, a sudden flash of fear knotting my stomach. The idea of permanence, of trusting again, was almost too much. But she just smiled, tucked it into the cup by the sink, and kissed my cheek. No pressure. No demands. Just patience. Just love, in its quietest, strongest form. We spent the early days of our life together doing small things, painting her kitchen cabinets a bright, reckless yellow that made us both laugh, planting a tiny garden in the backyard where nothing but weeds had grown for years, rescuing a mangy, one-eyed cat from the shelter and naming him Bandit after he stole an entire rotisserie chicken off the counter the first night home. Small things. Ordinary things. But they felt extraordinary. Because they were ours. Because they were real. Because every nail hammered, every flower planted, every late-night movie watched with Bandit purring at our feet was a choice, a conscious, stubborn choice to live, to love, to trust again. Sometimes, when the nights were quiet and the world was asleep around us, I would wake from a dream where Rachel stood at the end of our old driveway, calling my name. And sometimes, for a moment, the grief would come rushing back, sharp and sudden and raw. But it didn't destroy me anymore. It didn't pull me under. I would lie there, feeling Ellie's steady breathing beside me, the warmth of her body anchoring me, and I would remind myself that life was over. That life had ended the night Rachel chose someone else. And that was okay. Because this new life, messy and imperfect and hard one, was better. Stronger. Mine. One Saturday in late April, Ellie and I took a drive out to the edge of town, where the hills rolled green and wide under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. We parked at the top of a ridge and sat on the hood of the car, passing a bottle of lemonade between us, watching the wind ripple through the fields below. After a while, Ellie nudged me gently. "You ever think about going back?" she asked. I knew what she meant. Not to Rachel. Not to that life. But to the idea of it. To forgiveness. To closure. I thought about it for a long moment, the bottle cold against my palms. "I don't know if I need to," I said finally. I think I already have." She smiled at me then, that slow, fierce smile that always made my chest ache in the best way. "Good," she said simply. And just like that, another weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying slid off my shoulders and disappeared into the wind. In May, I received a letter. No return address. But I knew the handwriting. Rachel. I sat on the porch steps with the unopened envelope in my hands, banded rubbing against my legs, the sun warm on my back. For a long time, I just held it, the paper thin and trembling between my fingers. Part of me didn't want to read it. What could she say that would change anything? But another part of me, a part that had grown stronger these past months, understood that closure wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it. Accepting it. Letting it go. I opened the letter. It was short. Not an apology. Not a plea for forgiveness. Just an acknowledgement. An admission of guilt. An admission of loss. A wish for my happiness, however I could find it. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the old battered notebook that still sat by my bedside, and let it be. No anger. No sorrow. Just acceptance. Rachel was part of my story. But she was not the end of it. Not anymore. Ellie and I built our life day by day. We learned each other's rhythms, her need for morning coffee before conversation, my habit of leaving notes tucked into her lunch bag, Bandit's tendency to knock things off shelves for attention. We fought, sometimes, over dishes, over forgotten plans, over the scars we both still carried. But we fought fairly. We fought with the understanding that love wasn't about never hurting each other. It was about choosing, again and again, to stay. To fight for each other. To build something worth fighting for. By summer, the town had thawed completely, and Granger's Hollow buzzed with life. Kids raced through sprinklers in front yards. Old men played checkers under the awning of the hardware store. The diner put picnic tables out front and served lemonade with extra ice. And in the middle of it all, Ellie and I lived our small, stubborn, beautiful life. I bought a house on the edge of town, a crooked little place with peeling paint and a yard that looked more like a jungle than a lawn. Ellie laughed when she saw it, but her eyes shone with excitement. We spent weekends tearing out old carpet, painting walls, building something that was messy and imperfect and ours. Something real. Something lasting. On a warm night in July, we stood on the back porch, the stars thick overhead, fireflies blinking lazily in the fields. Ellie slipped her hand into mine. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah," I said. "We have." And as we stood there, wrapped in the soft, golden breath of summer, I realized something. I wasn't the man who had sat alone at that party, watching his wife betray him. I wasn't the man who had fled into the night, broken and bleeding. I wasn't the man who had curled up in a motel bed, drowning in grief. I was someone new. Someone stronger. Someone alive. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was ready for it. Because life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about surviving it. Enduring it. And then, somehow, choosing to love again anyway. Choosing to believe that even after everything, even after betrayal and heartbreak and loss, there can still be hope. Still be joy. Still be a life worth living. A life worth building. A life worth fighting for. And as I stood there with Ellie, The stars wheeling overhead and bandit weaving between our legs, I smiled. Not because everything was perfect. Not because everything was easy. But because, for the first time in a long, long time, everything was right. Thank you for being with us on The Hidden Truth. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. The secrets are waiting to be revealed. See you soon.